What if Russia stops supplying its gas entirely to European countries? How much do you think energy prices would increase if this happens? What are the chances that Russia will stop supplying its gas? And will this plunge Europe into a deeper recession than expected? Well, you don't need to answer just yet. But these are some very important questions that will have massive implications for consumers, businesses, and the entire global economy. In September, Russia announced that it will keep the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline to the EU closed until sanctions are lifted, effectively cutting off 60% of Russian gas supplies. And we can safely say that lifting Russian sanctions is off the negotiation table, so Europe, especially countries that are part of the EU, will be without a large chunk of Russian gas supply this winter. But you might think, does this really matter much? After all, recent reports have stated that Europe has stockpiled so much energy reserve that prices actually went negative, although only for an hour and it happened only in one price benchmark. Well, it depends. Although there are reasons to be optimistic about Europe's energy situation, a total cutoff will still have significant repercussions. Perhaps not today, but in the near future. So, let's talk about Europe's energy situation, its ties with Russia, and examine some hypothetical situations. Okay, so as you might already know, the European economy is highly exposed to the risk of a shutoff of Russian natural gas. Germany, for example, had 32% of its gas supplied by Russia in 2021. The Netherlands 15%, Italy 40%, Austria 80%, although it has fallen to less than 50% according to its environment minister, and Hungary 85%. In total, the EU received roughly 40% of its gas via Russian pipelines. And like I said before, Russia is already trying to cut gas supplies to Europe. Russian gas supplies to Finland, the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Denmark, and Poland have been halted completely, as countries are unwilling to pay with rubles per Russia's requests. And Nord Stream 1, which is a 745 miles long undersea gas pipeline that connect from the coast of St. Petersburg to Germany, has been closed after a mysterious leak caused by an explosion. In this chart here, you can see that the blue line, which represents import volume through Nord Stream 1, has completely stopped since September. The Yamal route, which goes through Poland, has completely stopped since June, which leaves the Ukraine transit route and the Turk Stream route still running, albeit at a lower capacity. This meant that Russian gas imports decreased from around 2 billion cubic meters per week before the war to only 300 million cubic meters per week, an 80% reduction. Now, in response, EU member countries have all agreed to reduce 15% of gas usage until March 2023. In this publication, the European Commission outlined a guide on how to reduce energy consumption for member states. These range from obvious measures like heating buildings to a lower temperature and using the AC less often, to more sophisticated measures like contract swaps between industrial consumers, which allow production to be carried out in less affected regions in case of large shortages. So far, Europe has lowered its demand by 7% year to date compared with the 2019 to 2021 average. It's not 15% yet, but it's still on track to meet its goals. Another way to solve this energy situation besides reducing demand is obviously increasing supply. Around June, the EU adopted legislations requiring EU underground gas storage to be filled to 80% of capacity by November. And so far, they have been successful at this. Europe has been able to double its liquefied natural gas imports, and as a result, Germany managed to fill its storage facilities to 99.5% capacity, France to 99.9%, and Italy 95.5%. Note that this doesn't mean that the world's gas supply is abundant. Rather, this was achieved by aggressive buying at an expensive price, which is likely funded by debt, outbidding Asian countries like Japan, which has also been scrambling to buy gas. By the way, unlike France or Italy, Germany doesn't have its own infrastructure for receiving gas. So in Germany's case, purchases are made under long-term contracts through terminals in other countries, most likely Belgium or the Netherlands, which makes the fact that it was able to fill up its storage even more remarkable and even more expensive. Also, it's worth mentioning that unusually warm weather in October has helped to reduce gas consumption, adding to the pile of good news for European countries. So, European countries have mostly succeeded at stockpiling gas reserve thus far. But how quickly will its gas storage be depleted? For Germany, it's 2.5 months. The storage capacity for Europe's biggest economy is at 24.8 billion cubic meters, while energy consumption in 2021 amounts to 100 billion cubic meters. In a study published by Rabobank here, Germany will still face gas shortages even if Russia still supplies Germany with some of its gas. There are 3 scenarios depicted here. The orange line represents some Russian supplies, the blue line represents no Russian supplies, and the gold line represents no Russian supplies plus an extremely cold winter, with the bar chart representing the supply and demand assumption. Honestly, all of the numbers look pretty bad, but this particular research was published in August, so we have to adjust the numbers a little bit. First, the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline was still open back then at 20% capacity, so the forecast for the some Russian gas scenario will probably be worse than this research depicts, since supply will be even lower. On the other hand, this research also assumes that the storage capacity will be around 80% because that's the numbers that they had back then. So, the scenario for no Russian gas will be a little bit better since Germany has managed to get that number up to 99%. But one thing that we know for sure, Germany is still projected to use more gas than it has available and eventually run out of supplies in all 3 scenarios, which is bad. Italy is not much better. In the scenario with some Russian gas, it will be able to ride on the winter with some gas supply left. But in the no Russian gas scenario, Italy too will run out of gas. Meanwhile, France and Spain will be able to hold on with no Russian gas and will only run out of gas supply in the event of a very cold winter. In this study, a very cold winter is defined as equal to the coldest temperature in the past decade. This research also states that France is a special case. Although at face value France appears to be out of the woods, the opposite is actually true. The state-owned utility company EDF only operates 26 out of its 57 nuclear reactors because of cracked pipes, lack of cooling water due to low water levels in the French River, and a radioactive leak. Maintenance has been planned but was continuously delayed due to COVID and several strikes in its power plants. The company forecasts its nuclear power output for this year to 275 to 285 terawatt hours, which is its lowest level in 30 years. Given the fact that the nuclear reactors account for 70% of French power generation, this is a serious problem. So, all of these scenarios depict that there is a real risk of gas shortages in the Eurozone either this winter or in spring. And even if countries are able to avoid shortages, there will still be damages caused by industries and firms shutting down due to a lack of gas. Finally, this year's storage is still filled with Russian gas. So if we assume that Russia will continue to hold supplies until summer next year, then next year's winter will probably be worse than this year's. But this study also assumes that supply from domestic and non-Russian gas stays equal, and there's hope. Norway, which is another major gas supplier, has promised that it will increase delivery to the EU by around 10 billion cubic meters this year, and it also plans to increase gas production through more investment into the sector. Of course, this is not guaranteed given that climate activists and certain political parties will object to this proposal. Italy, meanwhile, has struck up some deals with Algeria, Azerbaijan, and Egypt to deliver 9 billion cubic meters of gas combined for 2022, with around 9 billion cubic meters for 2023. Altogether, this might just prevent a gas shortage if Russia stops supplying gas entirely to Italy. But so far, there is still plenty of uncertainty about whether these nations will keep their promises or not, especially Algeria because of its political instability and increasing domestic demand. There's also the factor of switching. A lot of countries have moved into alternative energy reserves such as renewables, nuclear, and coal. For example, as German-fired coal power stations are activated again, the IMF estimates that these power stations can substitute for around 5 gigawatt of power capacity, or 4.5 billion cubic meters of gas a year. And the steady increase of renewable energy at 2.7 BCM a year will also help. Okay, so far we have examined some of European countries' storage capacity and whether they will run out of gas or not. But what about the effects on prices and the cost of living crisis? And what about other European countries that we haven't examined here? Well, the price of gas went from 15 euro per megawatt hour to 343 euro per megawatt hour over the summer. And while it has come down to 120 euro per megawatt hour as of recording, that's almost a 10% increase compared to last year. So, the poorest household in European countries have already seen their cost of living increase by around 10 to 25%. These increases happen through the prices that people pay for refined oil and gas products, and also indirectly by pushing up the cost of producing other goods and services. So, even other nations that don't depend on Russian energy like the UK will be burdened by this cost of living crisis. But on the other hand, higher gas prices will help to incentivize people to consume less gas, so there is still reason to be optimistic here. Most European governments have also helped to cushion the blow by helping the poor and crucial industries, although this meant that most of the burden will fall on industries unprotected by the government. So now, let's summarize how the no Russian gas scenario could play out in most European countries. Note that this will only be a quick summary rather than a detailed explanation. We can categorize countries into low risk, medium risk, high risk, and very high risk tier. The low risk countries are UK, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Denmark. These are all countries with little to no dependence on Russian gas. So in the event of a Russian gas shutdown, these countries could adjust pretty well to the supply shock and shortages are unlikely to happen. We can also categorize Belgium and the Netherlands as low risk. While they both have some reliance on Russian gas, 6% and 15% respectively, they both have adequate import infrastructure and alternative supply routes to replace the Russian gas supply. France could also be categorized as low risk, although we cannot overlook the problem with its state utility company EDF. In the medium risk tier, we have Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These countries are pretty reliant on Russian gas, but they have existing and soon to be launched alternative import capacity. For example, Finland and Estonia are jointly developing an LNG import terminal that should be able to help them to adjust to the supply shock. Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, and Slovenia could also belong to the medium risk tier. For example, Poland and Bulgaria do have a large share of their gas imported from Russia. But overall, gas plays a less important role in the energy mix, with Poland mostly relying on coal and Bulgaria mostly on nuclear power. Meanwhile, Romania is a producer of gas, so it should be able to replace the lost supply by directing its own gas for domestic consumption. In the high-risk tier, we have Germany, Italy, and Austria. All three have a high reliance on Russian gas and will struggle to replace it should Russia stop supplying its gas. All three countries are now scrambling to gain alternative supply by any means necessary, but it's hard to imagine that they will be able to fully replace their share of Russian gas. Meanwhile, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary can be categorized in the very high-risk tier. These countries have a very high reliance on Russian gas, with alternative supply routes that go through constrained countries, Germany, Italy, and Austria. So in the event of no Russian gas, we can expect significant shortages and price increases in these countries. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.